Hello again, students. We're going to continue topic 1, changes in the late 19th century, by looking at the rise of big business in the United States. Now, this is related back to the industrialization of the U.S., which is going to allow for some of these very, very wealthy corporations to rise in the country, some of the innovative business techniques used by these businesses, and help from the United States government as it generally passes laws and regulations designed to help businesses, as we saw previously. And this is a good theme to remember from the late 19th century should you ever come across a question that asks about the relationship of the federal government and businesses. Generally, the answer is going to be whichever one helped businesses the most, because that was kind of the government's focus. The foundation of this is going to be the corporation. Corporations have their roots in the joint stock companies that founded some of the colonies in North America. And in this, a lot of wealthy Englishmen would pool their money together to start up a colony, and then as the colony turned a profit, they would all share a portion of the profit. In addition, then, they also shared a portion of the risk. Should it fail, they all lost whatever money they put into it. Corporations work in a similar way, and it's a way to spread out the risk. People who own stock in a corporation are all shareholders. They own a share of that corporation. They own a share of the money that was used, that is invested into the corporation, but also then they are entitled to a share of the profits depending on how much stock they own. Corporations then elect boards of directors to manage the company, and that board of directors usually hires a CEO to run the company. Compare that, as you can see on this chart here, with family-owned businesses, where a single individual is usually the person who puts the money into it. They also are the owner, and their family members tend to be the people who do the day-to-day management and also work with the employees. Now, this is typical in the 19th century of much smaller companies. Corporations today that we would see, most big businesses that you think of, Nike, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Amazon, they're corporations. An example you might know of a large-scale family-owned business would be the Trump Organization, because it is not publicly shared. You can't buy stock in that. All the profits go to Trump and his family. One of the things I want to point out, though, at the bottom on the corporation chart is how employees are kind of disconnected from the corporation. This is more akin to what you would expect today, in that an employee gets paid a wage for his or her work, and what they make is usually not tied to the success of the corporation. Some corporations in this time period will form what are called cartels. A cartel is when competing corporations cooperate with each other to decrease the amount of production, and therefore driving up the prices based on the idea of supply and demand. If there is less of a supply of something, the price of it will go up. Corporations that would do this in the late 19th century were the railroads, were good examples of this, where they would coordinate with each other who was going to run trains in which section of the country. Therefore, they could raise their prices and make more profit. A modern day cartel would be OPEC, which is an organization of different nations that produce oil, most of them Middle Eastern countries, and they conspire to decrease the amount of oil they produce in an effort to drive up the price of oil and gasoline. Corporations in the late 19th century are going to employ a variety of business management techniques and innovations to increase the efficiency with which they produce products and therefore maximize profits at the end. Because the less resources you can put into the making of your product, including time, the more you make when you sell that product at the end. Some of these will be vertical and horizontal integration and scientific management. Scientific management techniques are ways in which managers would go in and look at how a product is being made in a factory and look for any sort of small change that they can make in the process to increase efficiency. This was used a lot in clothing industry in the late 19th century, and looking at how the young women who worked at those sewing machines would take the fabric and put it into the sewing machine, or maybe how they took it off of the sewing machine when they were done stitching it. And something as small as that may only shave half a second off the time of each piece that they're making, but over time that would add up into a little bit less time put into each of those products. Horizontal integration and vertical integration on this chart are illustrated using the Standard Oil Company. Horizontal integration is taking all the smaller companies, the competing companies, and buying them up and consolidating them into one company. And this will eliminate redundancies. You might have more, in this case, refineries than you need, so you could close some of those refineries. Or maybe you don't need as many managers because you've got one big company instead of several small ones, and you could eliminate those positions. Vertical integration, I tend to think more as being associated with Andrew Carnegie and Carnegie Steel. Now, vertical integration is where you try to control every step of the supply chain leading up to your product. So in the case of Carnegie and Steel, he wants to control the iron mines. He will buy the iron mines that he will refine the ore into steel from. He will buy up the coal mines that he uses as fuel to fire the Bessemer furnaces. He will buy the rail cars that they run on and the train tracks, the railroads that bring them there. Now, what this means is that at every step of the way, Carnegie can charge himself whatever he wants. He doesn't pay more for the iron than he wants to pay because he owns the mine that's selling him the iron. So what he's going to do is just charge enough that he can keep that iron mine in business or that railroad in business, and therefore at the end, when he sells his steel, he will sell it at maximum profit. You may or may not have noticed that some of these innovative business techniques would not exactly be good for the overall health of the U.S. economy. And you would be right. The late 19th century is a time of one of the largest wealth gaps in American history. The difference between what the men at the top who owned the businesses that we see on this slide here and the average American who worked for them in terms of wealth and income was astronomical. The man in the upper left-hand corner is John D. Rockefeller, and he ran Standard Oil. At one point, Standard Oil refined 90% of the oil in the United States. And in today's terms, John D. Rockefeller would be 3 times wealthier than Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon. To the upper right, we see Andrew Carnegie, who owned steel-making plants. The lower left, we see Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad baron. And the lower right, the guy who looks like the Monopoly Man, and that is not a coincidence because it's based off of him, is J.P. Morgan, the banker's banker. J.P. Morgan had enough money in his bank that he was able to bail out the U.S. government with a loan when we ran into financial problems. So there's a lot of money there. And what you may have noticed is that there's a potential for monopoly in these techniques, particularly with horizontal integration. And monopolies are problems in our economic system because a capitalist economic system relies on competition. And when you buy up all the competition, there is nothing that is preventing you from raising prices to a level that could be incredibly harmful to the American consumers because there's no competition to help drive that down. Historians therefore have a hard time in whether or not they should describe these men as captains of industry or robber barons, as these men whose innovations and new techniques led them to the top, or who got there by undercutting competition and stepping on the little guy. Now, on the robber baron side of this, we look at the issues of monopolies. Monopolies were actually illegal in most states. So what these corporations would do, Standard Oil being a good example of this, is they would form what's called a trust. Now, a trust has a board of trustees, and it's not actually a company that makes anything. It's just this board. And the board would be made up of people who have controlling shares. They owned enough stock to have a majority vote in all of the different companies that competed, in this case, for oil refining companies. And therefore, they could collaborate to coordinate the companies between them, even though they're still legally considered to be separate companies. And this, of course, is going to decrease competition, which is not good in a capitalist system because the way capitalism is supposed to benefit the consumers is competition drives down prices and make things more affordable. Monopolies and trusts decrease that competition and drive up prices. Some of the other problems then are just for the workers themselves, as they are one of the easiest ways for the company to increase its profits by paying them less. And if the workers tried to organize into unions to fight this, to try and bring wages back up, the companies would ruthlessly suppress those attempts to organize. On the other side, the captains of industry, their innovations drove the American economy, and they did provide jobs, even if those were oftentimes low-paying jobs, but by increasing productivity and such, they would hire more people. The other aspect of it was philanthropy. These guys gave away tons and tons of money. An example is seen here on the slide. This is Carnegie Hall in New York City, very famous performing arts center, and it was paid for with money donated by Andrew Carnegie. Vanderbilt University is another example of this, but there are libraries and museums all over the country that have these guys' names on them that were built by them. And part of this is this idea that there's a sense, Andrew Carnegie sort of summed it up, that once you are wealthy, you have an obligation to give back to society. But at the same time, when Carnegie's saying this, he's also saying that rich people know how to manage money better than other people and therefore have a right to give it away. So there's a little bit of paternalism in his tone. In that period, we'll also see a couple of theories about wealth and its distribution develop in the United States that we really still kind of see today. One of these is the idea of the wealth gospel, or what we oftentimes see today as the prosperity gospel, which is the idea that rich people are being rewarded by God for being a good person. And so that rewards on earth are an indication of God's favor, and therefore being poor must indicate that you are out of God's favor because you did something wrong. The other end of this is social Darwinism, which is a misapplication of Darwin's ideas of natural selection to American economic system. And they're saying that those people who rise to the top are the most fit, the survival of the fittest. Those at the bottom, therefore, are the least fit. And it doesn't do any good to spend money trying to help those people, because by helping less fit people, you are weakening the species overall. Now, you can probably see how, especially with the racial stratification of U.S. society, this could end up in some pretty nasty racist theory, and it will. But you can also see the idea of being poor as being your own fault because you don't work hard enough or whatever else is still part of American mindset today. Lastly, let's look at how they attempted to regulate business in the late 19th century. So by about 1890, some people in the U.S. government started growing concerned about this lack of competition and the wealth gap and all the other problems that were being caused there. So we'll see the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is there to regulate, primarily it was put together to regulate shipping rates on railroads. However, it could only regulate those things that crossed state lines, so railroads crossing state lines, and they really didn't have the ability to make any laws. The other thing is the Sherman Antitrust Act, shown here on this slide. The Sherman Antitrust Act was designed to break up those trusts, but generally the courts in antitrust cases are going to side with the businesses, and businesses very quickly figure out that they can use this law to break up unions. So when workers would try to form unions, they would sue them under the Sherman Antitrust Act as creating a sort of labor trust, a monopoly on labor, which would try to force the bosses to comply with higher wages, greater worker safety, or whatever else. So overall, there is some government attempts at regulation, but those are not very effective. The organizer for Lesson 4 is broken up into 3 parts, looking at innovations of big business, evaluating big business for the good and the bad side of it, and then looking at the ways the government attempted to regulate those big businesses. So at the top, within innovations, just tell me what they did, in other words, define them, and give an example of that. Now, it could be some of the individuals at the top, it could be a 19th century company, or it could be a modern company that is an example of this particular technique. The evaluate part, pros and cons, you can find them throughout the outline. Give me about 3 to 5 of each. What's good about big business, what's bad about big business. At the bottom, the regulate part, you're just telling me what each of these things did, the ICC and Sherman Antitrust Act, and what sort of effects they had. And hint, they weren't very effective. So as an example on the innovate part, we look at cartels. I give you the definition of cartels there. And as an example, I give you railroads. You could also use oil today. Okay? Good luck. I love you. Bye-bye.